History as it happens, January 11th, 2024. Life and death in Gaza.
The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel.
United Nations laws have established Palestine as a free and independent state, to be known as Israel.
Fighting between Arabs and Jews was a commonplace occurrence, and there were many casualties on both sides through stabbing and shooting.
Jaffa itself has become an almost deserted city, most of the 70,000 inhabitants having left when the state of Israel was proclaimed.
Victorious Haganah troops have driven the Arabs out of the beleaguered city, taking many prisoners.
We reject the statements by some Israeli ministers and lawmakers calling for a resettlement of Palestinians outside of Gaza. These statements are irresponsible, they're inflammatory, and they only make it harder to secure a future of Palestinian-led Gaza.
Before Gaza became synonymous with poverty and human misery, it was a crossroads, a commercial hub. Before it became the Gaza Strip and a seedbed of Palestinian nationalism, it was home to 80,000 Arabs and of little interest to Zionists. Today, as Israel tries to destroy Hamas, it is destroying Gaza in the process, repeating the same mistake of wars past. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Well, Netanyahu himself said very clearly that he wanted to reduce the density of the population of Gaza. Okay? We always come back to the same question and to the same impossibility. Next to Gaza, you have a desert, an Egyptian desert. If there was not the desert, in 1948, the refugees would have crossed into Egypt. They wouldn't have stayed into Gaza. So they are in Gaza, and they will remain in Gaza.
Just as I was about to record this podcast, I spotted a headline. All children under 5 in Gaza, about 335,000 kids, are at high risk of malnutrition and preventable death, according to UNICEF. The group is calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. This report coincides with Secretary of State Antony Blinken's 4th trip to Israel since the Hamas attack on October 7. Blinken also visited Arab states as he is trying to prevent Netanyahu's war from spreading.
One thing that we've heard clearly every place we've gone, including in Israel, is that escalation is in no one's interest. No one's seeking it. No one wants to see other fronts opened in this conflict. And more than that, as I've already shared, we have countries around the region that are using their relationships, using their influence to try to make sure that that doesn't happen.
He also mentioned the plight of Palestinian civilians.
Too many Palestinian civilians are suffering from insufficient access to food, to water, to medicine, to other essential supplies. Children, most of all. We continue to raise with Israel the need to do everything possible to facilitate the provision of humanitarian aid to Gaza.
Well, here we are in early January, and at least an estimated 20,000 Palestinians have been killed. Thousands more wounded, their neighborhoods flattened by indiscriminate Israeli bombardment. The IDF says it's killed or captured up to 9,000 Hamas fighters out of an estimated total force of some 35,000 men. By the count of historian Jean-Pierre Filiu, there have been 15 wars between Israel and the Arabs of Gaza since 1948 to today, 1948 being the year of the Jewish state's birth. And you can see footage of these wars in old newsreels, footage of Israeli units conquering Arab areas and driving out their Arab inhabitants.
Camera records from Palestine show heavy damage in and around the Arab city of Jaffa as Haganah troops move up to new positions along the war-scarred roads. Jaffa itself has become an almost deserted city, most of the 70,000 inhabitants having left when the state of Israel was proclaimed.
Indeed, the seeds of today's conflict were planted in the 20th century. World War I and the Balfour Declaration, UN partition in 1947.
Saudi Arabia? No. Soviet Union? Yes. The United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes.
The resolution
and the Declaration of the State of Israel by David Ben-Gurion in 1948. But in an essay for Foreign Affairs, the official publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, Jean-Pierre Filiu writes, in stark contrast to its present-day reality of impoverishment, extreme water shortages, and unending human misery, the oasis of Gaza, or Wadi Gaza, was celebrated for centuries for the lushness of its vegetation and the coolness of its shade. As important, however, was its strategic value, for Gaza connects Egypt to the Levant. Its advantageous position has meant that the land has been contested since the 17th century BC. I learned so much from this essay about origins and continuities. Those are subjects we talk about a lot on this podcast. Origins and continuities. As mentioned, today's war is the 15th between Israel and the Arabs of Gaza. In between wars, there were Israeli attempts to solve the problem of the Palestinian refugees there. And more recently, the Israeli policy was one of mowing the grass, periodic bouts of violence, while allowing Qatari money to flow into Hamas pockets. Every approach taken, violent or otherwise, by Israel to deal with Gaza over the decades has failed. None had in mind Palestinian nationalist aspirations. For instance, as Filiu writes in his Foreign Affairs essay, it took some years before Gazan refugees turned to militant activism. At first, both Israel and Egypt managed to tamp down on the so-called Fedayeen, guerrilla fighters mainly drawn from the camps in Gaza who sought to infiltrate Israel. But by the mid-1950s, the Egyptian leader Nasser began using them for proxy raids against Israel, thus beginning the cycle of attacks and reprisals that is so closely associated with the territory today. Filiu goes on to say, in April 1956, the security officer of a kibbutz close to the Palestinian enclave was killed by infiltrators from Gaza, causing Moshe Dayan, the Israeli chief of staff, to warn Israelis of the unresolved grievances simmering in the territory. He said, "Let us not today cast the blame on the murderers. For 8 years now they have sat in the refugee camps in Gaza, and before their eyes we have turned their lands and villages where they and their fathers dwelt into our home." Filiu goes on to write, eradicating the Fedayeen presence from Gaza became a top priority for Ben-Gurion and Dayan. In November 1956, the Israeli army took control of the Strip as part of a coordinated offensive with France and the United Kingdom against Nasser's Egypt, the Suez Crisis.
Israeli contingents slogged through the Sinai Desert in the direction of the Suez Canal in an operation that eventually subjugated the area and mopped up nests of Fedayeen commandos, whose raids precipitated the Israeli invasion. The Gaza Strip, long a source of friction, now is the road to Egypt.
And the essay continues, during 4 months of occupation, around 1,000 Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces, including 2 massacres. The trauma was so profound, Filiu writes, that when the Israelis withdrew under U.S. pressure, the Palestinian population called for the return of Egyptian rule instead of the UN trusteeship that had initially been envisioned. A historic opportunity to build a Palestinian entity that could evolve into a state had been lost. Meanwhile, the Fedayeen fled to Kuwait, where they founded in 1959 the Palestinian Liberation Movement, known as Fatah, with Yasser Arafat as its leader. Jean-Pierre Filiu is a professor of Middle East Studies at Sciences Po in Paris. He has been visiting Gaza, Israel, and the Palestinian territory since 1980, and his award-winning Gaza, A History was published in 2014. He is a preeminent scholar of this subject, whose books have been printed in 15 languages. Jean-Pierre Filiu, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for your invitation.
Yes, joining us from Paris. It's an honor to have you here. Your essay in Foreign Affairs was a tour de force, the history of Gaza. Why don't we just start briefly with Gaza before the 20th century? Is it an accident of geography, or was there something more to it, the fact that ancient Gaza seemed to have been a crossroads for empires and armies and markets?
Well, one has to understand that during the millenniums, in fact, 4 millenniums, Gaza was indeed a crossroad because it was a very prosperous oasis that served as a commercial hub or marketplace between Africa and Asia. So you can say it's an accident of geography or the blessing of geography because of its strategic location. And it was also the Mediterranean outlet for the caravans coming from the Arabian Peninsula. So for centuries, it was a very much coveted city and region for the empires ruling the Middle East or ruling Egypt, each one wanting to conquer it in order to go on the other side and vice versa. but it was also very prosperous. So you had stable population that was there. It was not just invaders coming in and populating it. The only instance when the population was replaced was after the siege, probably one of the most murderous sieges of all the ones that Gaza endured in 332 BC by Alexander the Great, where after destroying the city, depopulating it, enslaving the children and women, resettled it with Greek settlers. But that's very unique, very unique.
Yeah.
But one can say that from the 7th century onwards, Gaza was Arabized. That means that the people in Gaza were speaking increasingly Arabic, were feeling they were Arabs. And so the Arab identity of Gaza has been confirmed and sustained during half a millennium.
And what I think is important here is the way you make this history relevant to what's going on today. Your argument is that we may think of Gaza today as this isolated, almost separate place, but it's very much integral to the region.
If Gaza is a result of its privileged geography, the Gaza Strip is a tragic outcome of history and of war. Because the Gaza Strip, as we know today, which is a territory of 360 square kilometers, I don't know how much it makes in miles, but a very small territory, is the direct product of the first Israeli-Arab war of 1948-1949. So this is what was left after a ceasefire was proclaimed between Israel and Egypt in January 1949. And in fact, the Gaza Strip is a strip. The word is very relevant because it is what is left, what was left of Arab Palestine, of what was the Arab Palestine during the British Mandate. And this strip became progressively an enclave, which is exactly the contrary of what was Gaza during centuries of history. And I repeat, it was a thriving oasis, a prosperous crossroad, a strategic outlet, an open city, and very often a free trade zone by the various historical standards.
Yes.
So in the catastrophe, what the Palestinians call the Nakba of 1948, there was a catastrophe inside of the catastrophe for Gaza because it was reduced to be a strip of land and not anymore an oasis and a crossroad. And on top of that, 200,000 refugees from all over Palestine sheltered in the Gaza Strip, which means that from then on, since 1948, 2/3 of the population of Gaza is comprised of Palestinian refugees that were forced out of their home by the creation of Israel in 1948.
That's right. It went from being a crossroads to essentially an open-air prison today. So let's talk about the 20th century. Before we get to 1948, we have World War I, the Balfour Declaration. I discussed this with Ian Lustig a couple of months ago. When does Gaza start becoming a seedbed of Palestinian nationalism? And was this area that we now call the Gaza Strip important to Zionists? Why don't we do the first part of that question first? When does it become a seedbed of Palestinian nationalism?
The moment in the so-called Gaza Strip, that is 1% of what was British Mandate Palestine, you have 25% of the Arab population of what was British Mandate Palestine, then logically such a concentration will breed progressively nationalist militancy. If on top of that, as I mentioned, 2/3 of this population are refugees, then of course their grievances are even stronger. And on top of that, you have the fact that the Gaza Strip was administered militarily by Egypt, but was not annexed, while Jordan was created by the annexation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem to what was called East Bank or Transjordan before 1948. So in this situation, you have 77% of what was British Mandate Palestine that is now Israel, 22% annexed to Jordan, into Jordan, and 1% that is just administered by Egypt. So the fact that there is no Egyptian sovereignty on it, but only an administration, of course, is an additional contribution to the progressive growth of Palestinian nationalist militancy.
And you call this a natural incubator for Palestinian nationalism in your essay. But before 48, do we see this happening, say, in the Arab revolt of the late 1930s?
Yes, because Gaza had this very long history, an Arab history, and was very proud of this Arab heritage, despite the fact that it was not a priority for the Zionists in the 20s or the 30s. It became a strong center of what was called the Great Arab Revolt from 36 to 39. And the repression was quite strong. And it was supposed to be part of the Arab state in the partition plan of the United Nations in 1947. So just to prove that the Arabness, the Arabity, the Arab identity of Gaza was never disputed even by the Zionist militants.
Why weren't the Zionists interested in this part of biblical Israel?
Well, there is a lot of debate about Gaza being part or not of the land of Israel. Most of the religious leaders consider that Gaza was not part of it because at the time of Samson and David, so in the Bible, in the very Bible, Gaza is known to be a center of the Philistines, who gives the word Palestine. And the Philistines were so-called sea people of dubious origin who came around the region and invaded the region 12th or 13th centuries BC. They established a 5-city federation, including Gaza. The 4 other cities of this 5-city federation are now in Israel, but the fact that Gaza had this very strong Philistine, at that time, Philistine character, the fact that it should be part of Eretz Israel from the Zionist point of view is very much debated, which is why there is not a strong, large movement inside Zionism historically to integrate Gaza into Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel.
Thank you for correcting me, clarifying that. I appreciate that. These are thorny issues because so much of what we're seeing today is the result of this very long debate over ancestral homelands, right? I think you've already alluded to how Gaza figured into the UN partition plan of 1947. Why did the Arabs reject partition?
Well, first, the Zionists accepted it, so before it became Israel, because with only 1/3 of the population of British Mandate Palestine, they were getting 55% of the land. So already it was quite a good deal for them. And they were hoping to better even the condition. But from the Arab point of view, already the injustice of such a partition was great. But there were great fears about the fate of the 200,000 plus Arabs who would live inside the Jewish state. And everything that happened afterwards confirmed the reality of those fears. The possibility of a transfer, which was, in fact, what happened in the so-called Nakba or catastrophe. And so the UN imposed the plan against the will of the local Arab population, but also against the will of the Arab neighboring states. So it was very clear that this plan would not be enforced peacefully. And in fact, the day after the UN vote, and I have to insist that despite the Cold War, the plan was voted in agreement between the United States of America and USSR, the Soviet Union. So they were both backing Israel and the Zionists on that. And the day after the partition plan was voted, a civil war started between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. And one has to understand that more than half of the Palestinians that fled away from their home because of the hostilities, expulsion, bombings, fled before the proclamation of the State of Israel. So before the starting of the Israeli-Arab War. And a lot of them fled already to the region of Gaza.
And this was a demographic disaster for Gaza.
Well, it was a global disaster, like what we see today is a global disaster. It's total, because it's social, it's sanitary, medical, ecological, environmental. That means that you change totally the very substance of a territory and its population by increasing it through influx of 200,000 plus refugees compared to 80,000 locals. That means also, and I insist on that, that what was a crossroad becomes an enclave, which means that economically, what was the very source of Gaza's prosperity disappears. A whole population that was quite active, quite efficient, full of initiative, is partially, and in fact in majority, reduced to depend on international assistance. That is a disaster for any population, and that has been going on in Gaza for now more than 7 decades.
The conflict did not start on October 7th. So after the declaration of the Jewish state of Israel in 48, there is a war, the Arab states invade. Israel and Egypt have an armistice in 1949, as you point out in your essay, and that is when the Gaza Strip is created. David Ben-Gurion, he had a plan for Gaza that same year in 1949. I did not know this until reading your essay at the Lausanne conference. What was this plan and why did it cause such an uproar? I think a lot of people listening to this will be surprised at what he had in mind.
Well, Ben-Gurion was a visionary. He proved it by leading Israel to independence in 48, but he also proved it the next year by understanding before anybody else in Israel that the very existence of the Gaza Strip and its concentration of refugees was a challenge for Israel. I'm speaking about 1949. And he understood that this had to be dealt with. So he made a daring proposal, first to annex Gaza, which was totally rejected by the Arab states, but also by the United States of America and the UN, because already Israel had expanded a lot compared with the Jewish state that was allocated through the partition plan. But what is crucial, he proposed to resettle 100,000 Palestinian refugees inside Israel, to return them back to their homes, in order to extend the so-called right of return of the refugees, in order to address their grievance once and for all. So between 100,000 and more than 700,000, the total of refugees, there is a big difference. But since Israel was built on the denial of the right of return of refugees, to impose the law of return of any Jew worldwide to Israel, there is a law of return against the right of return. And then there was an uproar in Israel, and the UN peace conference, it was in Lausanne, collapsed. And one has to also to realize that this was the first and last UN comprehensive peace conference to address all the dimensions of the Israeli-Arab dispute. What we have seen ever since were only partial conference or peace processes, mostly through the mediation of the United States of America.
And later on, Ariel Sharon had a similar plan to try to resettle Palestinians inside Israel. This is so important when we consider what's happening today. This is your most trenchant observation in this essay. From the very beginning of this, we start the beginning in 1948, 1949. On the one hand, Israeli leaders understood that having Palestinians bottled up in the Gaza Strip was bad for everyone, including Israel, but that plans to allow some Palestinians back in were doomed to fail. So every Israeli approach to this problem, as you document in your essay, failed because in the end, none of them really had Palestinian national aspirations as the end goal here. Is that what you're saying?
with one major exception. Yitzhak Rabin in 1993 with the peace process, the Oslo agreements.
We who have seen our relatives and friends killed before our eyes, we who have attended their funerals and cannot look into the eyes of their parents, we who have come from a land where parents buried their children, we who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears.
I counted through history 15 Israeli wars on Gaza. This one is the 15th. All those 15 wars have been won militarily by Israel, but they have all been lost politically for the very reason you just underlined. One, the first Intifada was militarily really won by Israel. In 1993, the Intifada was crushed, but it was won politically through the peace process because Yitzhak Rabin agreed to recognize Yasser Arafat as a peace partner. He agreed to recognize the Palestinian Liberation Organization as a representative of the Palestinian people, and he agreed to deliver 3/4 of the Gaza Strip at that time to a so-called Palestinian Authority. So this is the only time when you had a political vision. You can see now that there is absolutely no political vision in Israel, but I'm afraid to say so also in America regarding the so-called day after in Gaza. The plan that was proposed yesterday by the Israeli Minister of Defense exclude any kind of national Palestinian representation in Gaza. In fact, what they have in mind is some kind of tribal militias depending on Israeli army, but without any Palestinian national identity. They don't want the Palestinian Authority back, and we all know, and it's pretty understandable, that they don't want Hamas anymore. But instead of countering Hamas with a credible Palestinian security partner, they want again to create, if I may say, to reinvent hot water. But it's impossible to reinvent it, especially with so much ruins now. Because who on the Palestinian side would be crazy enough to enter this kind of scheme? So it won't work. So again, you can win all the wars you want. You can destroy all the cities, all the refugee camps you want. You can achieve an occupation of many months. But at the end of the day, you will have to withdraw and you will have to deliver Gaza to somebody. And this somebody has to be Palestinian and has to be credible in order to ensure the security of the Israelis, which is what I try to put forward in my essay, that without restoring a modicum of prosperity, of normal economic life into Gaza, nothing will work after this terrible war of destruction.
What do you make of Israeli officials today who are talking about voluntary, if you will, emigration of Palestinians outside Gaza? Some people say this is ethnic cleansing, that the end goal here is to drive as many Palestinians out of Gaza as possible.
Well, Netanyahu himself said very clearly that he wanted to reduce the density of the population of Gaza. Okay, we always come back to the same question and to the same impossibility. Next to Gaza, you have a desert, an Egyptian desert. If there was not the desert, in 1948, the refugees would have crossed into Egypt. They wouldn't have stayed into Gaza. So they are in Gaza, and they will remain in Gaza. And what is more important is that they will be even more resolute to stay in Gaza after this ordeal, after what they consider already the second Nakba or the catastrophe that fell on them. So those people won't leave. So the whole issue is about dealing with a reality. You cannot escape reality. Ben-Gurion understood that in 1949, which is why he put forward his own proposal. Rabin understood that in 1993, which is why he dealt with the PLO. And now you have the same reality, that is the reality of Gaza. And instead of dealing with it in pure military terms, instead of making the condition of unliving in Gaza so harsh, inhuman, in order to force people out, well, better, because at the end of the day, Gaza will remain where it is, which is the southwestern corner of Israel. So better prepare a future between the two people than pursue military pipe dreams that will only bring more destruction and more hatred. This is basically my argument, that people have to think out of the box. This is the 15th Israeli war on Gaza. And the Israeli withdrew. They withdrew in 1957, they withdrew in 2005, and they will withdraw. And when they will withdraw, Gaza will stay with its population. So Israel has a very vested interest in having the most friendly people in Gaza and won't be able to decide eternally what is good for Gaza, because what is really good for Israel would be for Gaza not to be an open-air prison, not to be a big destruction field, but to be a prosperous oasis entering in cooperation, trade, exchanges with its neighbor Israel, and of course, in the framework of a two-state solution with a demilitarized Palestine that will be at peace and in security with Israel.
I found it fascinating, the history prior to the Israeli occupation that begins in 1967 after the Six-Day War, the Israeli occupation of Gaza. In the 1950s, after Nasser comes to power in Egypt, he uses Palestinians almost as proxies to attack Israel. There had been fighting going on through this period, not just after the PLO comes into existence in the late 60s and in the 70s. We're talking about the 1950s here. But during the 1956 war over Suez, I learned from reading your essay that there were atrocities committed by the Israeli Defense Forces in Gaza. And as mentioned earlier, Israeli leaders also understood, though, that this status quo was not sustainable. They just couldn't keep Palestinians locked up in the Gaza Strip forever. You say that a historic opportunity to build a Palestinian entity that could evolve into a state was lost after the 1956 war. What did you mean by that?
Because after the war, it was President Eisenhower who pressured Israel to withdraw. The first and last time Israel had to withdraw unconditionally from Palestinian territory. No? So that means also that the Gazan population has seen the Israeli leave many times through history. And they remember that eventually they leave. But what happened at that time was that UN was supposed to establish a trusteeship on Gaza that could have evolved into a UN-sponsored Palestinian entity through the years or the decades. But it didn't happen because Nasser reestablished the military administration he had. And in fact, Ben-Gurion was pretty happy with that. He said that Nasser has learned the lesson, and in fact, during the following 10 years until the Six-Day War, he repressed any kind of Palestinian activism very strongly. But today there is no Nasser in town. There is no Nasser. Nobody will play that role. The only people who can police the Gaza Strip are Palestinians. And in order for Israel to have the best security at its border, it should already prepare for the most credible Palestinian partners. And the most credible Palestinian partner have to be politically legitimate. They have to be part of a political process, of a peace process, of redevelopment of Gaza, because the idea is that after all this destruction, after all this agony, 1% of the population of the Gaza Strip has already been killed. 1%. So it's mind-boggling. So after that, you have to have something different. So in my essay that you kindly mentioned, I put forward the perspective of Gaza, like in 2005. You had the former president of the World Bank, James Wolfson, who was at that time special envoy of the Quartet of the Middle East, which was comprised of United States of America, United Nations, United European Union and Russia, and he put forward a $3 billion plan for developing Gaza. But Sharon withdrew unilaterally. And the key to this plan was mobility, was trade. The moment you established blockade, then it's over. The moment you follow a scorched earth policy, the moment you have this kind of policies, and of course, the fate of Gaza is doomed. And I'm afraid that what Israelis have in mind now is a scorched earth policy on a much wider scale. It's totally wrong, of course, for the first victims who are the civilians of the Gaza Strip, but it is also totally wrong for Israel. You cannot, and the horrendous massacres of October 7th prove it, you cannot base your security as Israel on the absolute insecurity of the other in the Gaza Strip.
I think one misconception here is, you hear this often in the West, that Gaza is poor because of Hamas. There is some truth to that, but it's the blockade that is probably more responsible for the dire conditions there.
Blockade is an act of war. The blockade on Gaza has been going on for 16 years. 16 years, 1/6. So, of course, the Hamas leadership is corrupt. The Hamas leadership is taking a big cut of any economic activity in Gaza, but the main source for such a misery is the blockade.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, in China, President Xi Jinping is exalting Mao and rewriting history to support his regime. Meanwhile, there are underground historians in China working to make sure their past isn't whitewashed in the service of the Communist Party. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.